गुणानुबन्धनविधौ सध्यासनिर्धार्मितं पापत्रापनिकृन्तनं तनभितां गोविन्द गानामृतैः श्रीगौराङ्ग गुणानुबन्धनविधौ सध्यासनिर्धार्मितं पापत्रापनिकृन्तनं तनभितां गोविन्दगानामृतं आनन्दाम्बुधिवर्धनैकनिपुणं कैवल्यनिस्वार्थं वन्दे रूपसनातनं रघुजुगं Śrī Jīva Gosvāmī Krishna Kirtana Ganana Param Premamritam Panidhi Akvato Namase Samandalapati Sanim Sadatu Chama Bhuttvādīnagani Karunaya Kopīna Kanthāsitau Krishna Kirtana Ganana Tanapano Premamritam Manidhi Dhīra jana priyau priyakarau Nirmasaram pujitau
Kumajnanatimidandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshurun militam yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Adunulambito bujo kanakabhatatu Sankirtanaya kapitaro kamalaya takshu Vishwambaro dvijabaro yugadharma palo Vande jagat priyakaro karunabhataro Vande Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sahodito Gurudaya Pushpavanto Chitro Sangdo Tamuno Vandeham Shri Ramakrishna Abhayo Charano Sako Sukado Paramanando Sundaro Subalapriyo Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye.
Well, I lost my controls. There we go. It came back. All right, glorious devotees. Shri Gaudiya Vaishnava Guru Parampara ki jai, Śrī Jīva Gosvāmī ki jai, Sat Sandarbhas ki jai, Anantakota Vaishnavinda ki jai. We will continue today with our presentation. Excuse me. I cannot read a message and do a presentation at the same time. I'm not yet that talented. So We're going to continue today with our discussion of the Bhagavat Sandarbha. And we'll be speaking about basically the Brahman Sandarbha. There is a place in the Bhagavat Sandarbha that Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī himself distinguishes as the Brahman Sandarbha. It consists of two anucchedas, but before we get there, a quick review, which is also and always good in dealing with this subject matter. So we go back to the Tattva Sandarbha and we remember the seed conception of the entire presentation from the 8th Anuccheda of the Mangala Charana. In one feature, Sri Krishna exists as pure consciousness without any manifest characteristic and is referred to as Brahman in some portions of the Vedas. In another feature, he expands as the Purusha who regulates the extrinsic potency Maya by his many plenary portions. In yet another of his principal forms, he is Narayan, resplendent in the spiritual sky, Vaikuntha. May that Sri Krishna, the original, complete, absolute truth, Swayam Bhagavan, bestow love for himself on those who worship his lotus feet in this world. This verse we can see is very closely connected with the Vedanti Tat verse from the first canto of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. Vedanti tat tat bhavidas tat bhamyas jnanamadvayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti sabjate. Learned transcendentalists who know the absolute truth call this non-dual substance Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan. So, how is this known as Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan? Excuse me, I'm very sorry. I hope everyone can hear me. If anyone cannot, please unmute yourself and let me know. I have a little bit of a different setup here due to a computer failure. We had to switch devices. So I will continue now. Please excuse me for the temporary interruption. So how the absolute truth is perceived. This is basically where Jīva Gosvāmī begins his description of the prameya, what is knowable. So first we were given a valid means of knowing, which he distilled down to the Bhagavat Purana for so many reasons. And then we go into the subject of the book, what is actually knowable? Well, the supreme absolute truth. What is that supreme absolute truth? Well, it is ourselves, everything around us, and even more than that. And if we go beyond that, what is perceptible by ourselves, then we come to an approach of the absolute truth. And according to our approach, as we discussed last week, we have different conceptions that are made available to us from revelation, from descending knowledge. Even the revelation of Brahman, as we will see today, is coming to us and descending to us from the transcendental realm. So I think this will be a very interesting discussion today, and we will proceed directly into the Bhagavat Sandarbha. Again, we remind you that we are only picking out select verses, and from those select verses, or in the case of a Sandarbha and Jiva's Sandarbhas, they're referred to as anucchedas. Anuccheda means a section, and in these various sections, Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī presents to us different aspects of the of what constitutes the realities of spiritual revelation coming from the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. So this Bhagavat Sandarbha, we're going to continue today with the distinction between Brahman and Bhagavan. Our discussion today will be primarily centered on this understanding of Brahman, the proper way to understand it according to the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, which is the sun around which all Gaudiya Vaishnava theology comes. So let us continue here. In the second Anuccheda, Jīva Gosvāmī writes, thus in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, as well as in some other texts, the one absolute truth is addressed by three names. In some places, the absolute is called Brahman, in others Paramatma, and yet others Bhagavan. But it should be noted that since Śrīla Vyasadeva witnessed a clear distinction between the absolute truth and the individual self in his trance, the absolute was not referred to as Jiva in this verse. Again, we're talking about the verses that delineate the spiritual revelation from the 7th chapter of the first canto of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. Vyasa had a revelation, and in his revelation, he was able to perceive Bhagavan Shri Krishna, the complete manifestation of the Supreme Lord. Also in this Anuccheda, we find since Paramatma is automatically understood by specifying the distinction between Brahman and Bhagavan, we will begin with an exposition of these two. When the absolute truth is defined without distinguishing between the conscious energetic source and its energies, it is called Brahman. So this distinction between Brahman and Bhagavan, the Upanishadic section of the Vedas and Vedanta Sutra make frequent use of the word Brahman. The Smritis of Paramatma and the Itihasas and Puranas of Bhagavan. So it's coming out here in the commentary that we find in the corpus of all the Vedic contribution to human society that the term Brahman is primarily in the Vedic and the Vedanta Sutra portion. And the Smritis deal with Paramatma, and the histories and the Itihasas, the histories and the Puranas, those bring out the nature of the Supreme in relation to his personality and his complete manifestation as Bhagavan. Jiva states that he will proceed to explain Brahman and Bhagavan first, by which the nature of Paramatma will be understood automatically. To prove that the one absolute has three names based on the realization of the worshipper, Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī cites two verses, Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam 5:12-11 and 4:11-30. The first of these is an instruction from Jad Bharat to King Rahugana. In it, the phrase Janam Visudam, pure consciousness, Paramartha, the ultimate of that which is to be attained, eka, one, anantaram abadi, devoid of any internal or external divisions, and satya, truth, are all determinants of Brahman. Pratyak, situated in the heart of a living being, and prasanta, unperturbed, referred to Paramatma. Now, as we proceed in today's class and going forward, we're going to take a deeper dive into an understanding of the nature of the presentation of the Sandarbhas by Jiva Goswāmī, how he structures the individual sections or anucchedas and brings out various philosophical points that comprise the various truths, the tattvas, that together melt together into the Siddhanta as understood by our sampradaya, the Madhva Gaudiya sampradaya. So this will give us a real insight into the deep work that Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī has done in this presentation, and how he has selectively found within the Bhagavat Purana the supports for the various philosophical points that he wants to make, and then he brings those out, elaborates upon them, and supports them, as he said in the Tattva Sandarbha, by the commentaries of the great acharyas that came before him. Sankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, and the great Sridhar Swami, the great commentator on Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. So he's using these sadhus as support for his interpretation of the Shastra. So here we find the complete package, Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, as presented in each and every anuccheda to a greater or lesser extent in providing the philosophical basis for the various tattvas that he's going to give to us. So here in the commentary, it's shown that these two verses, if we look to the Sanskrit of the verses themselves, we can look to the individual Sanskrit words, and we see by looking carefully that these three aspects of the absolute truth are there in these verses of the Bhagavatam, and that's what's coming out in this commentary. We'll continue. And then in Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam 4.11.30, Anandamatra, indistinguished bliss, refers to Brahman, and Pratyag Atma, the self within all selves, to Paramatma. Upapana samasta sakti, comprehending all potencies, is an adjective referring to Bhagavan. So in these verses, all these nomenclatures are used, and we can see that the speakers in these different places in the Bhagavatam that are being used as exemplars by Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī point specifically, although the words are not used, Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, the different nomenclatures within the Sanskrit verses are pointing in those directions. Since Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam is the mature fruit of the Vedic tree, Nigama Kalpa Taror Galitam Phalam, And since, according to Garuda Purana, it supplies the meaning of Vedanta Sutra, it reconciles the various manifestations of the Absolute described in the Vedic literature in different ways. Although different transcendentalists follow diverse processes and worship a variety of forms of the Absolute as supreme, Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam explains that reality is one only, but manifests differently according to the qualification of the worshiper. So we discussed this to some extent in our last discussion as to the nature of our extraordinary good fortune in somehow or other contacting the dispensation, the merciful dispensation of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas coming from the advent of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, wherein immediately by coming to contact with these sadhus, following Raganuga, the line of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we're being given entrance into the conception of not only the personal absolute, Bhagavan, beyond the material realm, beyond Paramatma, but Bhagavan in his most intimate manifestation as Sri Krishna, Krishna Vraj. So just amazing. That's why, as I said, as devotees advance and realize the extraordinary good fortune, they cannot but chant with tears pouring from their eyes when they think of this amazing gift that they've received, this dispensation of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu coming down from his direct associates through the disciplic succession to us today. Extraordinary mercy in this most fallen age of mankind. We're going to go on and look at a couple things from the third anuccheda. Bhagavan is qualified, absolute. Anuccheda 3. So the sage Parasara goes on to say, O sage, the letter Ba has two meanings, nourisher and supporter. The letter Ga has three meanings, leader, carrier, and creator. The six qualities of controlling potency, inconceivable power, fame, wealth, knowledge, and absence of attachment in their totality are called Bhaga. All the living beings reside, Vasanti, in Bhagavan, who is God within and the self of all creation, and he also resides in them. This is the meaning of the letter Va. Therefore, he is the imperishable reality. Parasara then concludes the word Bhagavan means complete knowledge, sensory power, bodily strength, controlling power, inconceivable power, and effulgence or beauty devoid of any repelling qualities. So now Jiva Goswami's giving a definition of Bhagavan. Now let's look at the absolute truth with qualities. And if we look, we can look to the statement of Parasara, and we can see how these qualities are defined by him. And from the Vishnu Purana, we understand this terminology, Bhagavan. And now we are going to proceed. So there's some anucchedas dealing with the fact that when we look to the qualified absolute, when we looked at the absolute as having qualities, then this aspect can be understood broadly through these six characteristics: wealth, strength, fame, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation. Now we're going to start today's deep dive, and we're going to go into the sixth anuccheda in complete detail. The person eligible for Brahman realization. And we're going to go through the entire anuccheda as it's presented by Jīva Gosvāmī, and then we'll unpack it to some extent to enter into a deep understanding of what is Brahman realization and what is not Brahman realization. Now, in the contemporary Gaudiya society, and especially coming from the initial ingress into the Western world by my spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Śrīla Prabhupada, a complete unpacking of the distinction between radical non-dualism, or what would be referred to as Mayavad philosophy, and Brahman realization was not really emphasized. Prabhupada was so much into giving the basis of a personal conception of the absolute that he did not take time to make clear distinction repeatedly regarding Brahman and Mayavad philosophy and the distinction between the two. His emphasis was basically, let's see the distinction between the personality of Godhead and a conception where the personality of Godhead is not considered. And so his main emphasis was that if the personality of Godhead is not fully conceived of in terms of the Vedic literature, then any other approach to the absolute truth, specifically Brahman realization or merging into the absolute, would not be beneficial. So he just wanted to emphasize what is the Gaudiya objective. What is our prayojan? Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Again and again and again, he emphasized that. And he did not unpack fully what we'd call radical non-dualism, which is Sankaracharya's interpretation of the Vedas in approaching the Brahman aspect, and the full understanding, which is what we're going to enter into now in this anuccheda, as how Brahman is presented, Brahman realization is presented in the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, and how those that desire, who have a desire, have to utilize bhakti to attain that realization. So he begins his sixth anuccheda as follows. In the following verse and a half, Sri Brahma explains to Narada some further specifics about the Brahman feature. So this is from the second canto. That which the sages know as Brahman, which is uninterrupted joy and completely devoid of grief, is merely the pedestal, pada, of Bhagavan, the Supreme Person. It is eternally tranquil, free from fear, exclusively of the nature of unadulterated consciousness, pure, unchanging beyond all cause and effect, the source of all individual beings, which cannot be realized through the performance of sacrifices or the chanting of Vedic mantras, and before which the external energy personified Maya flees out of shame. So Brahma is giving a general explanation here to Narada of what is the nature of Brahman and what is the nature of Brahman in relationship to Bhagavan. Jiva writes himself, he continues after quoting the verse and says, we will now offer further elaboration and exposition on the Vedanti verse, which will continue through the completion of Paramatma Sandarbha. So, as we said, this is such a central point of the theme of the Sandarbhas, this Vedanti tattvavidas tattvamyas gyanamadvayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti subjate. This verse will be unpacked and fully explained by Jīva Gosvāmī through reference to what's in the Bhagavat Purana, all the way through to the completion of the Paramatma Sandarbha. Then we switch, and Jīva Gosvāmī introduces the Parivas Sutra, which is the key to understanding the inner secrets of the Bhagavatam, Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. So we have a way to get there. Once we get there, then we'll enter into the Krishna Sandarbha. Jiva continues, according to the specific qualifications and disposition of the spiritual aspirant, the absolute truth reveals himself in a specific way. Yayatamam prapadyante. All of them, as they surrender unto me, I reward accordingly. How do we surrender? Everyone surrenders due to the gracious dispensation coming from the transcendental realm. There's no question of surrender based on what we have at our disposal from the material environment, which is inert. There is nothing there. So anything that we're going to know, whether that knowledge is about Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan, that is all descending knowledge. To elucidate this principle, Sri Bhamaji describes the characteristics of a person eligible to realize Brahman in his prayers to Bhagavan. And now we go to that central core of the understanding of Krishna's youthful activities and the Brahma Vimohan Leela. After this Leela, and Brahma had so many revelations, which we will not go there now in this presentation, but everyone, I think, who's listening here has some insights into that revelation from Swami Tripurari. So, O unlimited Lord, Brahma prayed, you have no attributes, a guna, and so your glory, Mahima, deserves to be perceived by pure-hearted selves. This perception arises from the immutable avikriyat, experience of or establishment in the self, swana bhavat. Being formless, arupata, this glory, Brahman, can be known through awareness of non-distinction from it, ananya bodhyat mataya, and not otherwise. So again, we speak and we look to the nature of revelation, and entering into revelation means that we not only obtain the correct conceptual orientation, but we also enter into that revelation through association with those that are familiar with it, and then by ourselves acquainting ourselves through, as said here, through a non-distinction, through an understanding by personal affiliation understanding ourselves to be of the nature of that transcendental realm, to accepting ourselves as being consciousness in essence. Jīva Gosvāmī continues and he writes, we will now offer elaboration and exposition on the Vedanta verse, which will continue. Wait, is this a duplicate? Yes, it is. I'm sorry. Let me go on. Jīva Gosvāmī writes, although Sri Brahma previously stated in his prayers that Bhagavan's Brahman and Bhagavan manifestations are both difficult to understand, he nevertheless states here, O unlimited Lord, O Brahman, you who are unlimited in form and attributes, the glory of that aspect in which you do not manifest the attributes existing within your essential nature is great. That's really the nature of Brahman, greatness. This glory by which is meant your greatness should by extension be understood to mean Brahma, or the boundless absolute. For it is said in the Shruti, wherefore is this called Brahman? Because it expands and causes others to expand. This glory of yours deserves to be perceived by pure-hearted selves, that is, to persons whose inner-hearted selves, that is, to persons whose inner perceptual facilities have been purified. In other words, the Brahman aspect is potentially revealed to their awareness. It is possible for this to happen. So now we get to what is the cause of such a perception of Brahman? How can, as the title of the anuccheda has been relayed here, what makes one eligible for such a perception? So Brahma's mentioned purity of heart. So what is the immediate cause of such perception? To this, Brahma says, it is due to experience of or establishment in the self, that is through awareness of the pure you principle, Tvam Padartha, the pure self. So to come, the beginning stage, Brahma is explaining through his prayer, the beginning stage to revelation in regards to one, which is the first revelation to come regarding the supreme absolute truth. More about that later. For the devotees, it is a little different. It comes from a purity of heart that allows a self-identification with the nature of that consciousness. So that's really such an important phrase, self-identification. And we've touched upon that earlier, that how we identify with the world around us determines what we become, what is our I, what is our my, what am I? All that is built upon our identification. Now, when we turn our consciousness towards the supreme, we begin by looking inward at the I-ness of what is the nature of my consciousness, because I myself, my surroundings, and even my physical attributes are continually changing, but the I remains constant. So this is where it starts. Jiva continues in the anuccheda. The objection may be raised that all experiences are mental states, anta karna vritti. So now we see how Jiva this is kind of an insight into his presentation of the Sandarbhas. He raises his own objections. The Purvapaksa. What is the objection? Well, the objection is, wait a minute, how can I perceive myself when everything that is perceptible to me has to go through the facilities that I have, which is my mind and senses. So my mental states are developed by what I perceive around me. My senses give input that affects my mentality and how I perceive things. And of course, how I would contemplate things to be. So you're saying, look within. Well, if I'm looking within, how can I look within without using my mind, which are transformations of the gross and subtle bodies? How can I do that? Jiva's raising the question. How can the material mind perceive the pure self, tvam padartha, which is devoid of such transformations? To this, Sri Brahma answers, this experience is immutable or free from any transformation. The minds of these persons are free from all said transformations, or rather the experience of self occurs beyond the range of mind and hence beyond the reach of mental or egoic modifications. So a key, this kind of a perception of the self has to be beyond the vrittis that come onto the mind by external perception. Well, how is that possible? Jiva brings up his own additional objection. Well, another objection may be raised that any experience of an object in the form of mental states or vrittis takes the shape of that object, whatever we're thinking of. That's our mind goes there. However, the pure self is not subject to anyone's experience, being situated within or beyond the senses. In answer to this, Brahmaji says, being formless, arupata, etc. Form means something that can be measured or conceived, visaya, an object of the senses. The self is devoid of any such shape. In other words, when the mind is free from any modifications caused by attachment to the gross or subtle bodies, then the pure self manifests itself. One has to become free of the influence of the senses upon the mind to such an extent that perception can come of the self, which is completely outside of the realm of experience that we're used to. So one has to come to a state of transcendence. Jiva continues. A final objection is that, so he's looking at all these objections and saying, no, if we look, this is how Brahmaji's saying that this can be overcome, this objection or that objection. And then Jiva goes on. A final objection is that even if one realizes the infinitesimal individual consciousness, how can God's Brahman aspect, which is complete, undivided consciousness, become revealed to him? Brahmaji answers, this glory can be known through awareness of non-distinction from it and not otherwise. Again, self-identification with the fact that we, in essence, are pure consciousness. This is a long anuccheda, and it really gives us a true insight into the way that Jīva Gosvāmī schools us and unpacks and utilizes verses from the Bhagavatam to make and give us the deep understandings that are there in the Bhagavatam, that we may not even be able to perceive ourselves just by reading the prayer of Brahma. What are these meanings? It's one prayer of Brahma from the 14th chapter of the 10th canto is full of it can be unpacked, and so much revelation can come to us. And that's what Jīva Gosvāmī does throughout the Sandarbhas, to give us the revelation of the Sambandha Gyan that constitutes Gaudiya Vaishnavism, our conception of the supreme absolute truth. And then he also unpacks the Abhideya and reveals the Prayojan. He continues, in other words, this realization of non-distinction is possible because Brahman and the Jiva share the same characteristic of being conscious by nature. Even if one recognizes that the self is pure consciousness, however, this does not result in the ability to experience oneness with Brahman by one's own efforts. One can, however, attain it by the power or grace of God, who has been worshipped by devotion, sadhana bhakti, which is the source and shelter of all perfections, with the aim of such realization. Now we come to the crucial, what I consider the crucial point to be understood at this time by ourselves, so that we can fully understand that there is Brahman realization. There is the possibility of a Sukadev entering into Brahman, but even that entrance requires the power and grace of Krishna, as Jiva is writing here. Without that, even Brahman realization is not possible. And now Jiva unpacks and provides more knowledge in this regard. Thus, Sutta Goswami says in the verse immediately following the Vedanti verse. So the next verse after the Vedanti verse, Sutta Goswami writes, therefore the wise, faithful sages see the absolute truth, as Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan, within the self through devotion coupled with knowledge and detachment acquired through the faculty of hearing. That God's mercy is instrumental in achieving Brahman realization is also stated by Sri Matsya to King Satyavrata. Then again, he pulls from the Bhagavatam and he says, quoting Matsya, you will also know my glory, which is celebrated as Parabrahman, for it will be thoroughly revealed to you within your heart, both as a result of your own profound inquiry and through my favor, through my force, you will have this revelation. So there's so much to unpack here, and I want to go through a couple verses and give you some insight. So from the commentary, we can read the following. One of the revolutionary ideas that Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī is pointing out to us is that Brahman realization is impossible without the mercy of God, which comes only as a result of the being's participation in devotion. In other words, Brahman realization is impossible without engagement in bhakti yoga. Thus, even the followers of Sankaracharya, the chief protagonist of Brahma Gyan, in recent times must imbibe the spirit of devotion, which is to say they must wed devotion to Gyan to attain perfection in their path. Otherwise, they encounter only misery in the form of repeated birth and death. And we come to the famous verse. And this verse was, as I said in the beginning, not completely unpacked. So His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, he would often quote this verse in saying that anybody that's striving for Brahman will fall down from that position. So without a full explanation, it's a way to immediately turn the consciousness of his disciples at that place and at that time to a personal manifestation of the supreme absolute truth, Krishna. So he would quote often, Yanye Ravindaksha Vimuktamaninas Twayasta Bhavadas Avisuda Budaya Aruya Krichena Parampadam Tata Patanchato Nadrita Yusmad Agraya. O lotus-eyed Lord, others, the followers of the path of pure knowledge, devoid of devotion, who consider themselves liberated and whose minds are impure due to a lack of devotion to you, fall from the high position they have attained with great difficulty due to having disregarded your lotus feet. In other words, to those people who strive to realize Brahman without utilizing bhakti, without that aspect being utilized, they will not be successful. There has to be a pinch of bhakti. And if that is not there, then their attainment of liberation is not possible. But you can use bhakti to realize Brahman. And that is also given to us in the Bhagavatam. And we come to an important verse that explains exactly how that is accomplished. And all we can do is read it and explain it and look at it through the eyes of our Gaudiya tradition. Śrī Jīva Gosvāmī says, one attains Brahman realization only by the influence of God. And we can quote this verse from the 3rd canto, 28th chapter. By practicing meditation, the yogi gradually develops love for Sri Hari. His heart melts due to love, and the hairs of his body stand erect due to due to excessive joy. He is constantly bathed in a stream of tears caused by eagerness. At that stage, the yogi withdraws his mind, which is used to attract God, just as a hook is used to catch fish, from the object of meditation. The prefix prati in the word pratilabdha bhava signifies that the meditator's attainment of bhava is not favorable, pratikula, since he has a personal motive. So this is the directive from the Bhagavatam as to how the Brahmavadis attain Brahman. What do? They first meditate as yogis on Hari, the absolute with form. What does that do? It can only do one thing. It can only melt their heart. Their hairs stand on end. Tears flow from their eyes in excessive love for that personality. But their goal is something else. So even though he's bathed in streams of tears caused by that eagerness to attain his goal, then once he's experienced Sri Hari, Then he withdraws his mind.
Due to having disregarded your right. What we can do is read it and explain it. And Śrī Jīva Gosvāmī said, and we can quote this verse from the third cantation, the yogi gradually develops love with his body, stand erect due to ignorance. Constantly bathed in a stream of tears, draws his mind, which is used to finish from the object of meditation. Labda, baba, signifies that the favorable, pratikula,
What is going on?
is the directive of attain Brahman.
I don't know
What
what's
do they
happening
do? They
here.
meditate.
Something's gone wrong. Hello? I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to continue. Somehow we had some feedback there.
It's better now.
Okay, thank you very much for that input. So imagine the state of the yogi, that he's tasting the sweetness of Krishna, and then he uses all of his energy and turns it off. Vishwanath Chakravarti's commentary to this verse from the Bhagavatam is, he's brutal in looking to these yogis and saying, he's basically saying from the Gaudiya viewpoint, what is wrong with you? You know, you have attained the darshan of the Supreme and you turn that off. You're such a cheater. You're like a fisherman who's taking his mind and he's capturing the Lord through his efforts. He's following sadhana bhakti. He's following the method, and then he's captured. And the Lord, of course, in being captured, he immediately wants to fulfill the desire, and the yogi turns off that revelation and proceeds to his Brahman revelation. And we find also from elsewhere in the commentary, when Sridhar Swami, the great commentator on the Bhagavat Purana, gives us some insight into the very second verse of the Bhagavat Purana, Projita Katava. He says that the prefix pra implies that the mere desire for liberation is also an example of cheating mentality. So if we remember that verse is saying this Bhagavatam is for those who are free. And Sridhar Swami in his commentary says those that are free, this means also those that are seeking impersonal liberation. They're not going to be able to enter into the mysteries of this Bhagavat Purana because they have a cheating mentality. The heart of such a yogi is not completely pure. A pure-hearted person never abandons the lotus feet of Sri Krishna under any circumstances, certainly not due to a preference of his Brahman aspect. According to Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī, the signs of love apparently manifest in a yogi, as described above, 328:34, the yogi with a hook-like mind, are not real symptoms of reti or transegoic love. Rather, they describe reti abhas, the mere semblance of such love. From the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, if symptoms of reti, such as softening of the heart, are observed in persons who have desires, such as that for liberation, other than devotion and love, then these symptoms do not indicate real reti, but only a semblance or shadow. And Krishna himself speaks of this Brahman realization and how that it is not possible without his mercy. In the Gita, he says, a person who serves me alone through unswerving devotion completely transcends these gunas of nature and becomes qualified to realize Brahman. The Advaitavadis, however, propose that ignorance can be vanquished by the culture of knowledge alone, and that one will attain Brahman realization by dint of this knowledge. However, such knowledge is also a product of material nature, albeit the sattva gun. So, yes, the followers of Sankaracharya's concocted conception of the attainment of Brahman, although they're purifying themselves to this and coming to the state of sattva, still consciousness in sattva does not result in the revelation of Brahman. We're going to continue this discussion in our next class and complete what is contained in the Bhagavat Sandarbha as the Brahman Sandarbha. To have a full understanding of this is quite helpful for us, that there are aspirants, there are Brahmavadis, they fall in one class. Yes, we condemn them. Yes, Vishwanath, can only condemn them. From our vantage point, anybody would give up Krishna's revelation of Krishna and clear their mind of that revelation just to enter into Brahman. He could only be looked at from the Gaudiya perspective as fool number one. With that, I will stop for today. And if anybody has a question, we will attempt as we can to answer that. And if not, I will, as always, offer my humble respects. Vanchakalpadubhyascha, kripasindhubheva-cha, patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavijin namo namaha. Thank you so much for your association, and I hope that this has nourished your spiritual understanding in some small way. Śrī Jīva Gosvāmī ki jai. Hare Krishna.
Krishna Kirtana Gana Ratana Pano Premamritam Manidhi Dhira Dhira Jana Priyau Priyakarau Nirma